I remember the first time sleep turned against me, not as a moment of panic or pain, but as a soft unraveling in the dark, as though the world around me had gently stepped aside to reveal something that had always been waiting beneath it, patient and breathless. And even now, all these years later, I can still feel the texture of that moment pressing against the inside of my skull like a hand made of memory rather than flesh, urging me to confess what I have carried for so long. And if you wish to understand what it truly means, stay with me until the end. I was young then, too young to understand the difference between my thoughts and the things that watched them. And on that night, I fell asleep believing I would wake to the same quiet comfort of my childhood. The low hum of the hab block generators, the slow creak of settling walls, the distant rhythm of machines that soothed me like mechanical lullabies. But instead, I awoke into a dream that did not feel like dreaming, a space too vast to belong to a child's mind, where the darkness seemed to breathe with a slow, knowing patience, and the air carried a faint vibration like the echo of a voice spoken before sound was invented. I did not see anything, not at first. I only felt the shape of something enormous circling just beyond the horizon of my awareness, brushing against my thoughts with a cold curiosity that made my breath catch even though I knew somehow that my body lay sleeping far away. The dream did not frighten me immediately. Fear came gradually, blooming like a bruise beneath the surface of the mind, because at first there was only silence, deep, heavy, absolute, and then the silence broke. It did not break with sound. It broke with presence. Something leaned toward me in that dark expanse, its attention narrowing like a spear of cold light that touched not my imagined dream self, but the real me, the one lying under the thin blankets of my childhood bunk, and I felt its interest settle over me like a second skin. It did not speak, but the absence of words felt like an invitation, or perhaps an expectation, as though it waited for me to say something it already knew I could not say. In that moment, the dream folded inward, and I saw a shape, not clearly, not with eyes, but with a kind of trembling awareness, as if the darkness itself had gathered its weight into a single point and pressed gently against the barrier of my mind. It was not violent. It did not tear or claw. It simply looked at me, and the act of being seen by something so vast and nameless made my thoughts flutter like startled birds trapped in a cage too small to contain their panic. I wanted to wake up, but waking is a skill the young have not yet learned to control, and so I remained suspended in that half place where time seemed to stretch thin, and the warmth of my sleeping body felt distant, unreachable. Slowly, the dark presence extended a whisper, not a voice but a pressure, a suggestion, a question formed without language, and the question was simple: who are you? I felt my mind recoil from the inquiry, not because it threatened me, but because answering it required peeling back layers of self I had never considered, exposing me to a scrutiny so deep it made my bones feel porous. I tried to think of my name, my family, the small details children cling to when they feel afraid, but each thought slipped away like mist, dissolving before it reached the edges of that vast attention. It was as though the presence was not content with what I believed myself to be. It wanted to know what lay beneath those beliefs, beneath the fragile structure of identity, beneath even the instinct to exist. And the realization that I could not answer, not fully, not honestly, filled me with a cold that felt older than childhood, older than the world that held me. The presence drifted closer, brushing against my mind with a curiosity that was neither kind nor cruel, only hungry for understanding, and I felt pieces of myself tremble in response, as though recognizing something they had long feared would one day come seeking them. The sensation was not pain, but something gentler, more intimate, a soft pressure that urged me to open, to reveal, to surrender some small part of myself in exchange for the promise of being understood. But even as a child, I knew instinctively that such understanding came at a cost I could not name. So I pulled away, gathering my thoughts into the tightest shape I could manage, like a hand closing protectively around a fragile object. And in that moment the dream shuddered, rippling like a disturbed pool of water. The presence recoiled slightly, not in anger but in interest, as though my resistance had surprised it, and I felt its attention sharpen, becoming more focused, more deliberate. Then, with a soft inevitability, the darkness around me shifted, collapsing inward with the weight of a slow inhale, and I felt myself falling, not down but outward, away from the thing that watched me, away from the question I could not answer, and the falling was gentle, like being laid into a bed of cold feathers. When I woke, my pillow was wet with tears I could not remember shedding, my chest tight with a fear I could not name, and the dim light of dawn felt thin, insufficient, as though the dream had stolen something from me. Not a memory, not a piece of my mind, but a quiet certainty I had never realized I carried. From that night onward, sleep was no longer a refuge. It was a threshold, a doorway. And although I was too young to understand it then, some part of me knew the truth that would haunt the rest of my life. Something in the warp had noticed me, and it would not forget. From the night that presence first folded itself into my sleep, a new rhythm began beneath my ribs, one made of tiny, intrusive murmurs that arrived like winter insects at the edge of hearing, and they learned to hide there, beneath the fold of ordinary breath, so that even when I thought myself awake, they walked the thin corridors of my mind and left faint footprints of unease. At first they came as whispers, no more than a rustle of thought, a phrase that blurred like frost on a window. But over months, the whispers shifted into something more deliberate, skirting the edges of my attention and slipping questions between ordinary moments. Not direct commands, but insinuations, soft as fog, suggesting possibilities and futures and wounds, as if testing the strength of the membrane that separated me from that wider dark. And I discovered that living with such proximity to the warp changes the cadences of a life in quiet ways you do not notice until they have altered everything. I would sit at the narrow window of my cell and watch the city breathe in cycles, while those whispers knotted themselves into the rhythm of my pulse and taught me to listen to the tiny variations of my heartbeat as though they might hide a meaning. They mapped the minutiae of my days, my walking routes, the small comforts I stole between lessons, the lullabies my nurse murmured before she left on her shift. And the more they learned, the more precise their suggestions became, shrinking the gap between private thought and invasive presence until the privacy of memory felt like a thin, easily pierced pain. I tried childish defenses at first, numbing the noise aloud, reciting the little prayers teachers gave us, holding my breath until my vision flashed and the world righted itself. But the whispers answered not with force but with mimicry, imitating my prayers with a softer, foreign intonation that left my chest tight with a homesick dread. Even the Skalam's wards and sigils taught them new seams, new routes, as if the warp itself is a teacher that adapts by learning your defenses and finding the lesson in their evasion. The instructors noticed eventually, marked my charts with patient notations, adjusted focus exercises, placed additional wards around my bed. But every precaution only taught the murmurs how to flatter their edges, how to slide a question into a stabilizing chant, and make doubt sound like devotion. There were nights when the murmurs synchronized with the clockwork in the corridors, matching the small mechanical clicks with an uncanny rhythm that made the world feel like a metronome riding my breath. In those hours, their attention sharpened, and they fed the ghosts of my life until they swelled and took form. Faces I had tried to forget, small cruelties committed in hunger, the precise way an elder's hand trembled when he blessed us. Things I had filed away as necessary compromises now unfurled like relics on display, and the shame they breathed into me made sleep feel like confession without absolution. The Skalam's discipline helped. Breathing rituals, focus grids, the slow counting of beads, and the recitation of stabilizing litanies that promised to stitch the mind's leaking edges closed. And at first those rituals were stitches, neat and helpful, reducing the worst of the noise to a tolerable hum. But the whispers learned gentleness of their own, how to mirror cadence while altering a single syllable into despair, how to slide doubt into litany until the very scriptures felt adulterated. And so the result was a double exposure that left me uncertain whether the comfort of ritual was real or only an elegant simulation made to lull me into weaker sleep. Over time, they took on a language of patience. Grand visions no longer needed to snatch my nights because small, daily thefts did the work better. Lost names, misremembered meetings, the gradual erasure of the smell of my mother's cooking until it remained only as a word, not a sensation. And I learned to wake and hunt for that vanished smell like a person searching for a lost home. That is the slow architecture of the warp's cruelty. Not always spectacle, but attrition. It reshapes love and fear into careful mathematics. Intimacy became hazardous because whispers can learn tenderness and use it as a lever. And so I kept people at a distance, measured affection into units I could repay, gave only what could be reclaimed without ripping the seams of my life. In daylight, the murmurs retreat to thin places beneath my breathing, subtle as servitors humming in a far bay. I move through scholastic rituals as if wearing armor made of quiet. At night they wake and grow articulate, and the narrative of my life becomes a palimpsest where other voices write over my handwriting. There are evenings when I sit entirely still in the dark and count the breaths, each inhale an island of certainty. And sometimes the counting holds and sometimes it does not. And when it fails, I feel a hollow in me like a missing tooth where numbing once lived. That hollow is the grief that gathers in marrow when you cannot trust your own mind to be the truth of you. And so my life has become measured in the intervals between whispers, the careful work of keeping small lights alight, the quiet arithmetic of affection, the enduring practice of holding a private sense of self against an audience that will never stop watching. I learned to be afraid of night the way some people learn to fear cliffs, not at the visible edge, but at the quiet space beneath where unseen depths wait. And when a dream first opened like a door, I realized that fear was not a childish fancy, but a practical geography I would map for the rest of my life. Sleep became an act of negotiation. I set small things around my bed, buttons scraped from my uniform, a silvered coin that had once belonged to my father, a scrap of the Skalem's taut fabric, and I rubbed them in my palms until their texture steadied my breath. Friends kept vigil on the nights my warding felt thin, and sometimes an elder would chant at the threshold to remind whatever listened that a household was not a single mind to be trespassed. But objects and songs are temporary fences. One evening, careless and brave in equal measure, I let the door feel its own hinge and stepped through in a dream that was not my making. It was not violent. It did not tear me. Instead, it unfolded like a corridor lined with doors, each labeled with a memory that I had assumed belonged to me alone. My mother ironing at dusk, a laughter shared under a leaking roof, a face I had loved and abandoned in a hurried farewell. The dream did not simply show these rooms. It opened them, and strangers crossed thresholds with the soft courtesy of guests who had waited a very long time to be let in. I woke that morning with my hands clenched around the edge of the bunk, nails thin with pressure, and a small shard of someone else's grief lodged where memory should have been. The Skalem medics blinked at my pallor, asked if I had taken a toxin, and I lied because I did not yet have language for the fact that a dream had come with souvenirs. After that night, the academy tightened its protocols. We learned to count our inhales with strict rhythms, to braid protective chants into the cadence of sleeping, to keep our beds in circles of salt and glyph. Masters argued over dietary measures that might alter the chemical microclimate of dreaming. Medics suggested bitter teas and long walks before dusk to dull the warp's appetite. I obeyed, but I also watched the dreams learn. Guardsmen and servitors can close a door with force. The warp closes doors with patience, and patience learns the weak points of any lock. The worst incursions are patient and small, an acquired phrase that lodges at the back of a lecture, a melody that arrives in the market and refuses to leave, the slow stealing of the smell of bread until a mother forgets the exact warmth of her oven. These are the ways a dream finds purchase, not with thunder but with attrition. My comrades attempted compassion. They slept near me, slept with their hands on my wrist to anchor me, and one lover, brave and foolish, shared a pillow and woke with tears staining their pillow because a foreign sadness had walked through both our rooms and left a quietly mislaid sorrow in their chest. Those moments changed how I loved. Every touch became negotiated. Affection came with disclaimers and small ceremonies meant to clean the shared air afterward. Water rinses, shared chants, the burning of particular incense a grandmother once used to ward sickness. The Skalem's curriculum adapted, teaching us to make internal doors, short incantations, number grids, and sensory anchors that acted like locks when repeated correctly. At first these worked as stitches. I could sleep with less fear, and for a while the dream doors creaked but did not admit guests. Then the warp learned to whisper through the seams. It mimicked our anchors, presented them in slightly wrong order, or echoed them in a voice so familiar it unstitched the security. Practical work at the academy emphasized containment, catching a dream in sigil nets, extracting its kernel for study, drying its edges into artifacts for prophecy. We learned the geometry of nets and the devotional heat needed to render a vision inert. But every captured dream left traces, and the process of turning living impressions into instruments felt like a small betrayal to the self. The utility comforted the faculty and often saved lives, but I sometimes felt like a thief cataloging what once belonged to human knights. Most nights I simply tried to be economical, a brief nap in the bright hours, a cold basin beside my bed, a chant until the edges of my mind calloused. I scheduled sleep alongside other psychers so there would be witnesses, and I carried cupboards of scent, herbal bundles, a strip of cloth dipped in a remembered stew to slow the dream's appetite. These practices kept my nights tolerable but never free. The knowledge that a dream could be an open door never left me. It shaped my posture, my schedules, the manner in which I leaned into life's small comforts. And yet sometimes, once in a rare and certain hour, a dream would pass through without theft, gifting instead a warm, uncanny tenderness. A memory of a day without fear, a face mended from years, a quiet future where my hands built something honest and did not cost another sorrow. Those nights tasted like contraband, and their sweetness reminded me why, despite fear and vigilance, I did not wish all dreams away. They were dangerous miracles that kept me human. I have learned to live like a careful sailor in fog, mapping my nights by stars that do not blink, keeping doors closed but polished, listening for the soft creak of hinges that marks curiosity, and sometimes, rarely, I let myself open the door just enough to remember that not every invitation brings harm. By the time the instructors declared me ready for formal psychana training, the whispers had already carved their patterns into the soft architecture of my mind, and I walked into those vaulted halls with the quiet, brittle poise of someone who had learned too early that knowledge can wound, that discipline can bruise, and that some lessons must be survived rather than mastered. The Scalem Progenium had felt strict but gentle compared to this place. Here, the air itself trembled with suppressed power, thick with incense meant to calm the warp's hunger and the metallic tang of fear sweating from novices who understood, whether consciously or not, that these halls were the threshold between a life they might keep and a life claimed by something older than empires. The instructors did not shout. They did not strike. Instead, they corrected with precision, each word delivered in a tone so measured it cut deeper than reprimand, because it told us plainly that our failures were not ours alone. They endangered everyone. I learned this on my first day, when I misstepped the opening syllable of a mental warding exercise and felt a small tremor shiver through the room, a ripple like a bead of dark ink dropped into clear water. The instructor's hand did not touch me, but his gaze pinned me to the floor with the cold weight of inevitability. And in that moment, I understood that errors in this place were not lapses of discipline. They were breaches, cracks through which entire tragedies might bloom. Our lessons began before dawn. We sat in circles etched with sigils older than human memory, breathing in unison until our minds aligned like gears in a great turning engine. They taught us to separate thought from reaction, to observe our emotions as though they belonged to strangers, to hold a memory without letting it touch us. Every success felt like a small death, the loss of a gasp, a laugh, a spontaneous warmth I once took for granted. At night, I practiced what they called the stillness in descent, a technique for entering sleep without opening the psychic apertures that dreams so easily pry at. It required imagining my consciousness as a candle flame shielded by cupped hands, not extinguished but protected, burning low enough to avoid attention. Some nights it worked. Most nights, flickers of warped curiosity pressed against the perimeter of my mind like cold fingertips tracing frost on a window pane. The instructors taught us how to resist, not with force but with shape. Thoughts could be sharpened into spears or softened into fog. Memories could be folded like paper so their edges would not cut. Fears could be thinned into threads until they snapped quietly under pressure. But some lessons left marks that no sigil could soothe. In the Chamber of Veils, where psionic echoes were allowed to roam under controlled conditions, we sat before thin curtains of shimmering warp light and learned to watch without absorbing, to see visions pass like shadows on a river without letting them anchor to us. I failed twice. The first failure was small, a vision of a distant battlefield, a name whispered by a dying soldier into the dust. It clung to me for 3 days, making me wake with that name on my tongue as if I had once known it. The second failure was worse. A soft dream curled through the veil, an orchard from my childhood, the smell of the warm fruit, the sound of my mother humming, and I reached for it before I could think, only to feel the dream twist, revealing empty branches, sour wind, and a silence that tasted wrong. It took the instructors hours to unhook the residual fear from my mind, and even longer to forgive myself for reaching. Some scars are carved from tenderness, others from longing. We learned combat disciplines as well, though the instructors framed them gently. They were not weapons, they said, but anchors, techniques to steady ourselves in the storm of another's terror. Projection grids, focus lances, thought disruption pulses, each required precision, not aggression. A psyker does not strike, one instructor murmured during a lesson. A psyker adjusts the shape of reality to reduce harm. But we all heard the unspoken truth beneath his words, or to survive it. The deepest scars formed in the silence trials, where we were placed alone in chambers of absolute quiet. No sound, no scent, no warmth, and told to keep our thoughts steady while sensory deprivation prodded the warp like a curious beast. I lasted longer than expected, but not long enough to impress myself. In that room, without sound to anchor me or breath to measure time against, my thoughts began to unravel into soft spirals, and I felt distant presences drift near, drawn by the tender unraveling of self that silence invites. When the instructors pulled me out, I was trembling, not from fear but from the clarity of knowing how thin the membrane between safety and ruin truly is. Through all this, the instructors spoke little of hope. Hope was not a virtue here, it was a liability. Instead, they taught endurance, boundaries, humility. Pride is the door, they said. Curiosity is the key. Fear is the wind that swings it open. I carved those words into my mind like runes. They were not comforting, but they kept me alive. And beneath everything, beneath the litanies, the discipline, the careful shaping of mind and memory, I carried the quiet truth that no lesson, no matter how skilled, could change the core of my suffering. That when I slept, when the world fell quiet, when fatigue loosened the knots of discipline, the dreams would still come, would still reach for me through the cracks. And every morning, as I opened my eyes to the dim light of the dormitory, and felt the faint bruises of unseen fingers on the edges of my soul, I understood what these lessons were truly teaching me. Not to become stronger than the warp, but to shape myself into someone who could survive knowing it would always be watching. There comes a point in a psyker's life when the mind, no matter how carefully trained or delicately warded, grows louder than the world around it. And I crossed that threshold quietly, almost without noticing. The way a person only realizes they've stepped onto thin ice when they hear the first soft crack beneath their feet. It began with small intrusions, flickers of emotion that were not mine, wisps of thought that drifted through my awareness like motes of dust catching light. And at first I mistook these for lapses in discipline, the mental equivalent of leaving a door slightly ajar. But soon the intrusions grew more deliberate, more rhythmic, until I understood with a sinking, marrow-deep dread that the warp no longer waited for me to sleep to draw near. Now it listened while I was awake, leaning closer each day as if the air between my skull and its endless silence had thinned. I would sit in the refectory with other novices, their chatter low and tired after long drills, and feel a sudden tug of longing that was not mine, or a wash of bitterness from someone who smiled at their tray as though savoring the meal. These emotions slid beneath my own like faint echoes, and I found myself flinching at joys I had not earned, grieving sorrows I had never lived. The instructors warned us that proximity breeds vulnerability. The more tightly woven our training, the more sensitive our thoughts became. But even they did not understand the strange loneliness that grows when your own mind becomes too amplified to trust. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, a physical anchor against the growing hum beneath my ribs, counting heartbeats to maintain a semblance of separation. But some days the noise grew so dense I felt as though I were drowning in other people's hidden truths, their quiet despairs and flickering hopes accumulating inside me like sediment in a stagnant pool. My sleep, already a fragile terrain, became even more treacherous. Dreams now arrived before I fully slipped under, curling through the threshold like tendrils of steam, carrying with them scents and textures foreign to my life. Salt winds from coasts I had never visited, the metallic tang of blood spilled in battles I had never fought, the warm ache of reunions I had never shared. At times, these impressions came woven with eerie tenderness, as though the warp attempted to soothe me into letting go of my resistance. But I had learned enough to understand the deceit in gentleness. The softer the approach, the deeper the wound it meant to press. Some mornings I woke with tears drying on my cheeks, not from fear but from borrowed griefs, the kind that linger in the chest like ghosts too polite to speak their names. The instructors increased my regimen, double chanting cycles, stricter meditation, an additional layer of runes etched into the walls of my quarters. But discipline only quiets what is willing to be quieted, and the noise inside me had begun to swell with its own intent. I tried to drown it in routine, sweeping the meditation hall long after others retired, scrubbing the scorched sigils on the floor until the stone grew warm beneath my palms, copying litanies until the ink blurred and smudged my fingertips. The instructors said work steadied the spirit, and for a time I believed it. But soon even the movements of my body seemed to echo too loudly inside my skull, reverberating like footsteps in an empty cathedral. It was during one of these cleaning rituals that I felt the first true rupture. Not a breach, not an attack, but a sudden, terrifying moment of alignment when my mind ceased its trembling and the warp fell into a listening stillness so absolute I could hear the shape of my own breath inside it. It was like being watched by silence itself. The broom fell from my hand. The hall seemed to stretch outward, the candlelight warping subtly as though the air had thickened, and the hum inside my chest stilled into a single, precise point of awareness, as sharp as a needle pressed gently against skin. For a heartbeat, then another, I sensed something listening from behind the veil, not reaching, not probing, but waiting, as though my thoughts had grown bright enough to serve as a beacon. I forced myself to inhale, then exhale, stacking breaths like shields, and the moment dissolved with a whispering recoil, leaving me dizzy with the relief of someone narrowly spared from answering a question they could not survive. After that, the instructors forbade me from solitary tasks. I was assigned an overseer, a quiet, patient psyker whose presence steadied the air around him like a stone dropped into rippling water. I hated needing him. I hated how his proximity muffled the noise in my skull, how his steady breathing drowned the faint murmurs that had become so familiar I missed them in their absence, like an addict longing for the very poison that ruined them. But the truth was undeniable. My mind had become too loud for safety, too loud for myself, too loud for anyone near me. In group lessons, I learned to place my thoughts behind glass walls, crafting inner chambers where I could hide the most volatile pieces of myself. But glass, no matter how carefully forged, remembers every crack it endures, and I felt my inner chambers groan beneath the weight of each new intrusion. Still, I endured. I breathed. I carried the noise the way a soldier carries an old wound, with resignation, with caution, with a strange, bitter pride. For there is a lesson all psychers eventually learn. The mind is not a fortress. It is a window. And some of us are born with glass too thin to keep the storms outside. There comes a point when the boundary between sleep and waking thins so quietly that you do not notice its fading until the first vision slips through, not as a dream born of your own mind, but as an image placed there by something watching from the far side of thought. And when those visions began to bloom within me, I understood with a hollow, sinking certainty that my fear of dreaming had not been paranoia. It had been prophecy. At first, the visions arrived softly, threading themselves into the final moments before sleep like delicate threads of foreign memory. A corridor I had never walked, lit by a flickering lumen strip, a hand clutching a talisman I did not recognize, the slow, rhythmic rocking of a ship's hull far from any world I had known. These images were gentle, almost polite, and for a moment I allowed myself to hope they were harmless, stray thoughts drifting through the warp, brushing my mind the way a breeze brushes the cheek. But then they deepened, grew specific, intimate, shaped with intent rather than chance. One night I saw a man kneeling in a chamber of cold iron, his face hidden behind his hands, his breath fogging the air. I felt his dread settle into my own chest, a heavy, trembling weight that made it difficult to breathe. Another night I stood upon a battlefield littered with still forms, the sky choked with smoke, and though I knew the vision was not mine, my mouth tasted of ash when I woke. The instructors told us that visions happen sometimes, that sensitive minds occasionally catch glimpses of distant events like reflections in rippling water, and at first I clung to that explanation, using it as a blanket to wrap around my dread. But these visions did not behave like reflections. They lingered, they clung, they waited, and each night they returned with greater clarity, as though someone were adjusting the focus of a lens. Soon, I stopped dreaming altogether in the way humans understand dreaming. Instead, I fell into borrowed futures, impossible memories, corridors carved from other people's terror. Some mornings I woke with the taste of salt on my lips, natural and bitter, as though I had cried through the night without knowing it. Other mornings I woke laughing, a brittle, exhausted sound that did not belong to me. Once I woke murmuring a prayer in a dialect I had never learned, the syllables still warm on my tongue even as they dissolved into nothingness. The visions showed me things I did not want to see. The moment a child's hand slipped from its mother's grasp during an evacuation, the flicker of doubt in a commissar's eyes before pulling a trigger, the final heartbeat of a medic whispering comfort to a dying soldier whose name she would never know. These glimpses were not grand prophecies. They were the quiet, private catastrophes that build the architecture of human suffering. And because they were so mundane, so painfully possible, they carried a weight far greater than the dramatic terrors we were told to expect. I tried to tell the instructors. I tried to explain how these visions did not fade like dreams, how they felt anchored to me, threaded through the fabric of my waking hours. But they heard only the surface of my words. They adjusted my regimen again. More litanies, tighter warding rites, longer meditative trances that left my limbs trembling. But discipline cannot unsee what the mind has already absorbed. Soon the visions began seeping into daylight. While walking to the training halls, I would feel a sudden surge of fear that was not mine, and the hallway would shift subtly, as though the air remembered a moment I had not lived. During meals, the clatter of utensils sometimes echoed strangely, becoming the metallic ring of distant gunfire, and I had to close my eyes and grip the table until the present settled back into place. Once, during a quiet study hour, the scent of old parchment dissolved into the acrid smell of smoke, and for a heartbeat I saw the library burning, the same library where I sat, unchanged, untouched, yet somehow already ruined in another thread of reality. I began to avoid eye contact with my peers, afraid of absorbing the weight of their unspoken anxieties. I sat alone in the corner of group meditations, anchoring my thoughts to the repetition of shallow breaths, but even breath betrayed me. Inhale, a flash of someone screaming into storm winds. Exhale, the final sigh of a person I had never met. Breath became a door through which visions passed. Sleep became an invitation, and waking became the fragile space between. Fear shaped my days in quiet ways. I spoke less, moved carefully, touched nothing without intention. I kept my hands clasped before me as though in prayer, not to honor the emperor but to hold myself together. The instructors noticed but said nothing. They had seen this before, the gradual thinning of a boundary that should remain thick, the tremor in the voice of someone who knows that part of their mind has begun answering to something beyond themselves. And beneath their silence lay the truth I refused to voice. Psykers who dream too vividly, too truthfully, too openly, rarely survive long without breaking, or being broken. Still, the visions were not always cruel. Some nights they offered small mercies, glimpses of hope drawn from strangers, a reunion on a crowded transport, a soldier singing softly to himself beneath a star-choked sky, a sister clutching her brother's hand as their ship finally escaped the gravity well of a dying world. These gentle moments did not erase the terror of others, but they reminded me that the warp held more than malice. It held memory, emotion, longing. But even these mercies came with a price, because every borrowed joy left me yearning for a life that was not mine, a life untouched by fear, untouched by visions, untouched by the knowledge that my dreams were no longer my own. And in that yearning lay the quiet, unbearable truth. I was losing the ability to tell where I ended and the warp began. Dreams I did not choose to see had become the mirror in which I recognized myself, fragmented, reverent, terrified, and terribly, achingly awake. There is a kind of quiet that psychers learn to fear long before they fear any scream, any vision, any nightmare. A quiet so complete that even the warp seems to hold its breath. A stillness so absolute that your own thoughts feel intrusive, too loud, too bright, as though merely thinking might shatter whatever fragile arrangement is holding reality together for one more moment. I reached that quiet gradually, like stepping into deeper and deeper water without noticing the temperature change, until one day I realized the world around me had gone unnaturally still, and the silence that settled on my mind was not peace. It was the tightening of a noose. For weeks the visions had grown thick and constant, blooming behind my eyelids even in daylight, weaving themselves into the thread of every breath. They were terrifying, yes, but they were familiar. Noise can be navigated, even noise born from the warp, if you learn its rhythms. But one morning I woke and found that all of it, the whispers, the borrowed memories, the flickers of emotion, had vanished. My mind felt clean, impossibly clean, like a room stripped bare of furniture and sound. The absence of intrusion should have brought relief. Instead, terror curled in my chest like a dormant animal waiting to spring. I rose from my narrow cot and padded across the dormitory floor, expecting at any moment to feel some lingering echo, some pressure against the edges of my mind. But there was nothing. My fellow psychers moved in their usual patterns, stretching, preparing for morning drills, exchanging small, whispered greetings. They looked unchanged, normal. But even as I mimicked their movements and reached for my robes, I knew something was wrong, because the warp does not grow quiet without cause, and when it observes silence, it is never out of mercy. In training that day, my instructors sensed the difference in me before I spoke a word. They paused mid-lecture, their eyes narrowing with a kind of clinical concern, and instructed me to repeat a focused chant. I complied. The chant rang perfectly, too perfectly. No flicker of interference. No stray pulse from the warp. The instructor's expression hardened into something unreadable, and he dismissed the class early. I spent the next hours undergoing tests, resonance checks, auric measurements, mental silencers, diagnostic rites, but every reading returned the same impossible result: stillness, an ocean without waves, a mind without tremors. "This is not stability," one instructor murmured at last, taking me aside. "This is anticipation." And though he did not specify whose anticipation or what awaited on the far side of that unnatural quiet, I understood. It was waiting for something, and that something was me. The silence stretched through the following days, growing more oppressive with each passing hour. I found myself hesitating before speaking, afraid my voice might split the quiet open like a wound. Meals tasted wrong, too sharp, as though my senses were overcompensating for the growing void inside me. When I slept, there were no dreams, not even my own. Sleep became a blank sheet, cold and heavy, as if my mind were being wrapped in thick cloth. Some nights I woke gasping, not from visions, but from the suffocating sense that I was being observed, though nothing stirred in the darkness. The other Psykers began avoiding me, not out of cruelty, but out of instinct. Animals avoid the eye of the storm long before humans understand it is coming. One evening, as the sky outside the training halls deepened into a violet dusk, I sat alone in the meditation chamber. The air shimmered faintly around the rune-etched walls. Incense burned in soft spirals. Candles flickered in a slow, meditative dance. And still, silence. I inhaled, feeling the shape of my lungs expand, and for an instant the silence pressed inward, shrinking to a single, razor-thin point directly behind my thoughts. It felt almost like a fingertip brushing my consciousness, as though something in the warp were leaning in, listening, amused. I froze. The sensation lingered. Then it withdrew, not gently, but with a soft recoil, like a predator stepping back to allow its prey a few more steps of freedom. My breath shook. My hands trembled. I left the chamber and sought out my overseer, the calm Psyker assigned to monitor me, but even he seemed unsettled by the quiet radiating from me. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the warp pauses before claiming something it intends to keep." His words clung to me like frost. That night the silence deepened further until even the natural noises of the hab block, the hum of generators, the distant rhythm of booted feet, the low murmur of evening conversation, felt distant and muffled as though wrapped in layers of thick cloth. I lay in my bunk, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as the silence pressed against my eardrums with a dull, oppressive weight. No dreams approached. No whispers threaded into my breathing. My mind floated alone in a vast black sea. Then slowly the silence began to pulse, faintly, softly, like breath, not mine, not human, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, as if something enormous were rousing itself somewhere beneath the layers of that quiet. I held my breath, and the silence inhaled. A chill crept through my limbs, and the silence exhaled. I curled inward, clutching my knees as the rhythm grew clearer, unmistakable. Something in the warp was breathing, slow, patient. A presence so vast that its inhalation felt like the drawing back of a distant tide and its exhalation like the soft pressure of being watched through a keyhole. It did not speak. It did not reach. It simply breathed and listened, waiting, anticipating, studying the shape of my fear. In that moment, I understood the truth that Psykers rarely live long enough to articulate. The warp screams often, but the true terror hides in its silences, for it is in the quiet moments that it chooses what part of you it will take. And as I lay there, suspended between breath and dread, I knew I was no longer fearing the dreams that chased me. I was fearing the moment the silence ended. The silence broke not with sound, but with a feeling, a soft, sinking shift in the architecture of my thoughts, like the floor of my mind giving way beneath me. And from that moment on, waking no longer felt like rising from sleep, but like falling into a deeper, more intricate layer of awareness I had never meant to enter. The first time it happened, I was sitting upright in the refectory, a tray of cooling ration stew untouched before me, when my vision blurred at the edges and the world tilted not sideways, not forward, but inward. as though reality itself had folded and I had slipped between its creases. For a long, breathless second, I did not move or speak, afraid that any action would reveal just how thin the boundary had become. And when my sight cleared, the room looked unchanged. The same weary novices, the same dim lumens, but everything beneath the surface felt misaligned, as though I was seeing it from one half step removed from where a living person ought to stand. I blinked, but the sensation didn't fade. I could still feel the warp breathing at the edges of perception, slower now, more deliberate, as though it had noticed my unease and found it pleasing. After that, waking became a negotiation. My instructors called it post-silence instability, a phrase meant to soothe with implication of temporary imbalance, but deep down they knew, and I knew, that the quiet had not been an end but a prelude, a drawing in of breath before the next exhale of intrusion. I would open my eyes each morning expecting to find myself in my narrow bunk, the smell of incense still lingering in the air, but instead I woke into fragments, moments displaced, sensations misordered. The warmth of the blanket would register before the awareness of my body beneath it. The taste of the air would reach me before the knowledge that I had inhaled. Sometimes I would hear footsteps in the hall long before my ears could catch the sound. Time folded itself into peculiar shapes, soft and elastic, stretching or collapsing with no warning. Days became rivers that split and rejoined, carrying me along currents I could not control. I began to lose my place in my own life. During lessons, I would feel myself slipping, as though my consciousness were sinking through layers of unseen water. The instructor's voice would become a distant murmur, and my fellow Psykers' thoughts would flare like beacons in the dark, sharp and bright and overwhelming. In those moments, I clung to the most basic anchors, my hands curled into fists, the pressure of my feet against the floor, the sound of my own breath counting time. But the warp had learned my anchors too. It mimicked them with unsettling accuracy. Once, in the training hall, I reached for my breath and found another breath layered beneath it, a quiet exhale that was not mine, exhaled inside my lungs like a second presence borrowing the rhythm of my body. I froze, heart hammering, afraid that to breathe again was to invite it further. When I finally gasped, the foreign breath withdrew with a sensation almost like disappointment. Sleep offered no reprieve. I drifted into unconsciousness as though falling through a hatch into open void. My dreams, once portals or visions or echoing corridors, now became thin, brittle constructs that collapsed as soon as I stepped into them. Sometimes I woke without transition, as though one moment I was dreaming and the next I was upright, heart contracting painfully in my chest with the jolt of someone who has been pushed rather than awakened. Other times I woke too slowly, my mind reassembling itself piece by piece like a machine coming online after a long disuse. And in those moments I could feel the warp still clinging to me, like a thin film of cold light spread across my thoughts. My overseer watched me closely now. He stayed near during meditations, hands folded calmly, voice steady as he guided me back from edges I didn't know I had reached. But even he, seasoned and sealed in wards far stronger than mine, could not hide the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the realization that whatever held me was no longer testing me. It was claiming me. The others avoided me entirely. Not out of malice, but out of instinct. To stand too near a mind slipping in and out of alignment is to risk slipping yourself, and psychers learn early to preserve what little stability they possess. Their absence hollowed the air around me. I walked through halls as though wrapped in a thin veil of separation, a membrane that prevented the world from fully touching me, and I wondered often whether it was meant to keep others safe from me, or me safe from whatever pressed on the other side. Sometimes, in the deepest moments of falling, I felt hands, not real hands, but impressions of touch, pulling at the edges of my awareness, coaxing me downward into that quiet, waiting depth. The sensation was not violent, not hostile. It felt almost gentle, almost familiar, and that terrified me more than any scream ever could. For there is a kind of horror that dawns slowly, the realization that the thing you fear has shaped itself to your shape, learned your patterns, softened its edges so your mind mistakes it for something you might welcome. And every time I fell, every time waking dissolved into drifting, I felt that presence waiting with a patience so absolute it felt like love twisted into a form the human soul was never meant to comprehend. One night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, unable to tell if I had truly woken or only dreamed I had, I raised my hand in the darkness and whispered my own name beneath my breath. The silence did not answer, but something in the air pulsed softly, as if acknowledging the sound, as if savoring it. And in that pulsing, I understood the truth I had been too afraid to name. Waking was no longer a refuge, no longer a return to myself. It was merely the moment when I began falling again. I had believed for years that the thresholds I kept were simple things, salt lines, glyphs traced at bedside, a tight litany repeated until the words dulled into muscle memory. But in truth, those measures were only part of an answer. The other part was the quiet architecture of my life itself, the small courtesies, the guarded smiles, the precise distances I kept from friends so their warmth would not leak into me and invite the warp's attention. And when the first full failure came, it was not dramatic or violent but domestic, like a lock undone by a key that had been learning the grain for a long time. It began with a missed step in the ritual, an exhausted breath, a chant left unfinished because my throat felt raw, and a dream that arrived like a polite visitor, cross-legged in my mind while I slept, arranging my memories in a way that made them look borrowed. I woke to the feeling of a pocket scraped of coin I had not noticed missing, a small absence, an itch behind the ribs where a memory used to sit easily. After that, the intrusions multiplied not as assaults but as mimicry. A market vendor would rattle a phrase that matched a cadence from a vision I had seen. A child's lullaby hummed across a corridor and settled into my bones as if it had always belonged to me. A gesture, simple, almost tender, made in a public hall would leave me carrying the afterimage of someone else's grief. These echoes were wedges the warp set into the seams of my life, tiny and patient, and each coincidence taught it the exact shape of my days. I tried repairs. I doubled wards, salted thresholds with new patternings, slept with a servitor sentinel humming a counter-frequency at my bedside. For a while the measures held, brittle ice on a winter pond, but the warp's craft is not blunt. It learned the architecture of tenderness and used that knowledge as leverage. A friend's comforting clasp at my shoulder after a hard lesson left me later with a memory of a seaside I had never seen. A well-meaning companion humming a tune left behind the echo of a name that did not belong to my life. Practical defenses could not staunch the more insidious thefts. The warp began furnishing my days with borrowed furniture, whole gestures and small regrets that slid into my speech like misplaced coins. I told tales in the mess hall of a childhood street I had never walked, described the pattern of a sunset over an ocean I had not sailed, and watched others nod as if listening to an old friend, while inside I felt my hands emptying of things that had once justified my claim to myself. The Skalam's lexicon named part of it mnemonic transference, and treated the phenomenon with clinical detachment, as if filing a specimen away could protect me from the ache of it. People noticed. The overseer's patience thinned into something porous and human. His concern showed in small, worried adjustments to our schedules, in his habit of pausing at my door and listening a heartbeat longer than duty required. My peers began to arrange themselves practically. Seating shifted in the hall, rituals altered to avoid shared air, whispered consultations performed just outside my hearing. It is an exile conducted with civility, a slow edging out performed by polite hands, and it felt like a theft because the world removed me even as it preserved its manners. Once a week we were made to undergo retrievals, controlled unspooling of captured visions so their origin could be traced and severed. I participated with the hollow compliance of someone brought to see the evidence of their own theft. The instructors would isolate a kernel on an obsidian tray, wind sigils around its edges, and watch it unspool beneath lattices of sympathetic chant. They spoke of contamination and transmission, of foreign psychic signatures that suggested proximity to certain warp streams. They were careful, clinical, humane in their language, but each session left me raw, a witness to the way my nights had been picked clean by strangers. And then, one cold night, the door finally failed in a way that could not be blamed on exhaustion alone. Wards burned low around my cot. Salts and iron had been arranged in concentric care by steady hands. An overseer sat a short distance with eyes that checked my breath with habitual flicks. I should have been safe. I dreamed of a garden I had never walked, olive trees under a thin sun, a low wall where a child's laughter rolled like marbles, and when I woke the taste of some foreign fruit still clung to my tongue. The overseer's face, when he looked at me, had the rawness of someone who had been given truth without preparation. He told me quietly that a sigil had been inverted somewhere in my chamber, a line of salt rearranged into an unknown pattern, a glyph that matched nothing in our scrolls, and that the intrusion had not been brute force but the work of patience, the slow translation of the private into public until even sanctity itself could be remade. After that night, the Academy's kindness hardened into procedures. I was moved to supervised quarters where observers changed shifts like tide markers. Visits from friends were scheduled and brief. Affection became a transaction with receipts, small rituals to wash the afterwards from shared breaths, water rinses, shared chants, the burning of scent to lift residual impressions. When I walked through corridors, I felt the stares no one gave openly, felt the way their bodies shifted away like a current avoiding a submerged hazard. I resented it. I ached for their eyes to remain soft and curious as before, but a rational part of me understood why they kept their distance. The warp teaches by imitation, and proximity is a lesson. I tried again to seal the door with more than wards. I learned the art of inner architecture, chambers within chambers of thought, glass walls within which my most volatile memories could be placed under lock and observation. I learned to keep my voice measured and my laughter brief, to let affection be an accounting rather than an effusion. For a time it worked. I held my inner rooms like relics behind iron doors, but glass remembers every crack. Doors remember how often they were opened. Even with everything locked, I began finding traces of other lives in my hands, animals named I did not own, recipes I could not have cooked, the precise ache of a person saying goodbye at a port I had never boarded. The theft was not only of privacy, it was theft of possibility. To have your future softened by someone else's memory is to feel your own horizons recede. The final cruelty of the open door is this: bodies can be guarded, rooms sealed, sigils placed, yet the self is porous. The warp will learn the pronunciation of your breath if you speak aloud enough, and then it will mimic you with a tenderness so accurate you cannot tell where mimicry ends and authenticity resumes. I live now under the cautious geometry of protection, aware always that the door can fail again any day, any night. There are few comforts left that belong to me entirely. When I close my eyes, I check not only for the presence of wards, but for the small human things that once anchored me. The scent of oil on my father's palms in memory, the way a friend called my name years ago, the texture of bread in my mouth, and I protect them jealously, like relics in a shrine. Still, sometimes in the quiet, when the academy is asleep and the overseer's breathing has evened into the rhythm of someone who trusts the world, a small, unfamiliar sorrow will settle in my chest, and I will know it is not my own. I will rise and walk the corridors, touch the cold stone, whisper the names I remember until their sound becomes mine again, and try to bolt the door with the faith of someone who has been taught to believe in small miracles. There is a moment near the end of all things, long after fear has learned your name, long after the warp has pressed its fingerprints into the soft clay of your thoughts, when the self no longer resists out of desperation, but out of a gentler instinct, like the closing of a flower at dusk. I discovered that moment not in crisis, not in a vision, not in any dramatic unraveling, but in the slow dimming of a day like any other, sitting alone in the observation hall as the last lumen strip flickered above me, and the silence settled with a weight that no longer felt like threat, but like a blanket drawn carefully across my shoulders. My life by then had become a geometry of caution, warded breaths, measured steps, thoughts arranged like artifacts in a vault. But even the most disciplined architecture erodes, and I had begun to understand that endurance does not mean victory, only survival long enough to see the shape of your own surrender. Yet what surprised me was how quiet that surrender felt. Not a breaking, but a loosening. Not the shattering of doors, but the soft widening of them, like hinges sighing after years of strain. I sat with that soft openness, listening to the faint hum of distant generators and the slow, faithful heartbeat in my own chest, and realized that for the first time in months, perhaps years, the presence at the edges of my thoughts did not press inward. It simply watched, observing with a patience I no longer mistook for malice. Perhaps it had learned me so thoroughly it no longer needed to test my boundaries. Perhaps it felt something akin to respect for the small, stubborn light I had kept alight despite its storms. Or perhaps it had simply grown tired, the way all things eventually do. Whatever the reason, I felt no fear, only a calm, weary clarity that the battles I had fought within myself were not meant to be won or lost, but carried. The instructors did not understand this quiet. They saw only exhaustion, a psyche frayed like cloth pulled too thin, and they tightened my routines once more. More chants, more focused drills, longer cleansing rites that left my skin smelling faintly of incense and old paper. I complied with gentle obedience, not out of hope that they would save me, but because their rituals had become familiar companions, small gestures of meaning in a life that had grown increasingly porous. My overseer remained at my side, though even he began stepping back, as though the air around me no longer carried danger but a solemn kind of distance. He sensed, I think, that whatever event the warp had been waiting for had already passed. And he was right. Nights grew easier, not safe but softer. I still woke with borrowed memories pulsing beneath my ribs, but they no longer clung like barbs. They floated, faint and harmless, like petals settling on water. I could feel the warp breathing still, but its breath no longer bent my thoughts. I drifted into sleep like a leaf into a slow-moving river, carried but not consumed. And in those drifting hours I began to dream, not visions, not intrusions, but quiet, fragile dreams shaped from the remnants of my own mind. I dreamed of sitting with my mother beneath a window cracked to let the city air in. I dreamed of walking along a corridor lit by pale morning light, the stone cool under my bare feet. I dreamed of a stranger placing a warm hand on my shoulder, not to claim me, but to steady me. These dreams were so small, so human, so tender that I woke each time with tears drying in the corners of my eyes. It felt like remembering a language I had almost forgotten. In the final week of my monitored confinement, my overseer asked gently, almost apologetically, what I felt when I looked inward. I searched for the right words, but language had never been made for this kind of quiet. So I simply said, I feel spacious. He looked at me with a mix of sadness and relief, as though he understood that I had reached a threshold beyond training, beyond fear, beyond the academy's reach. They discharged me not as cured, not as stable, but as balanced, a designation reserved for those who have walked to the brink and learned not to fall. They assigned me to a pilgrimage outpost far from the worst warp tides, a place where Psykers serve quietly, guiding pilgrims through night terrors or helping the dying release their final thoughts without fear. It is quiet work, kind work, work meant for hands that have learned gentleness through suffering. On my first night there, I sat outside beneath a starless sky, the air cold and thin, the smell of incense drifting from a nearby shrine. I closed my eyes and listened for the presence I had carried for so long, the breath beneath my breath, the watcher behind the veil. It was still there, distant now, diffuse, not a threat, not a companion, more like the memory of a storm long past, the smell of rain lingering in the soil after the clouds have moved on. I breathed once deeply and felt my own breath, the true one, fill my chest with quiet warmth. For the first time since childhood, I felt fully awake, fully myself. And as I stood to return to the outpost, my hand brushed the doorway and I whispered a small, instinctive prayer. Not for protection, not for strength, but for gratitude. Gratitude that despite everything, despite the noise and the silence and the falling and the fear, I had carried some small, stubborn ember of selfhood to this quiet place at the edge of the Imperium. a soft ending for a life that was never quiet, a gentle breath after years of trembling. And in that breath I heard myself, only myself, whisper into the darkness, "I am still here."